Good morning. It's very special to be here with you this morning. Before I get into my presentation, I just want to share with you why this is so special for me. My great-grandfather, Elmer Bowers, was an engineer with the Reading Railroad, and he logged more than 1 million miles as engineer of a locomotive. And I have been a rail fan all my life and had my own model railroad, N-scale model railroad of the chassis system, but all the railroads represented here had trackage rights on my little empire. So it's great to be here. And there's Elmer right there. Special to be here with you this morning. In October 2013, myself and the commander of Marine Corps recruiting in Alabama paid a visit to the current president of Birmingham Southern College, General Charles Krulak, U.S. Marine Corps retired, who served as the 31st Commandant of the Marine Corps. During our office call with General Krulak, the retired general inquired about the state of Marine Corps recruiting and making Marines. We were very happy to tell the general that our quality has never been higher, that the trajectory was continuing to go upward, and in every measurable category, the Marine Corps was getting better young men and women of character than we've ever gotten. The general was very happy to hear that. He reflected back on his time as Commandant on why he made recruiting and making Marines so important, because he said it all starts with people. And then he reflected back on his time as a major and lieutenant colonel and the struggles the officers of his generation had to fight to rebuild the Marine Corps after the wreckage of the Vietnam War and the country's transition to an all-volunteer force. He grew reflective, he got nostalgic, he nodded his head, and he said, yes, Lew Wilson saved the Marine Corps. Now, coming from General Krulak, I found this to be an incredible statement. I found it to be all the more incredible because I had been walking past Lew Wilson's picture on the 6th District Command Board every day for the past year and had never thought too much about it. You see, Lew Wilson was one of the 37 colonels who has commanded the 6th Marine Corps District, the position I'm blessed to have now. So I began to do some reading on Lew Wilson to find out what General Krulak was talking about. And then the reading turned into research, and the research turned into me actually going into General Wilson's personal archives up at the Gray Research Center at Quantico, Virginia. And what unfolded before me was an epic and riveting tale of such tremendous strategic leadership, vision, willpower, and moral courage that it's very special to be able to share it with you here today. So I'm going to talk to you about the transformational leadership of General Lew Wilson. But in a larger sense, we're going to talk about making Marines in the all-volunteer era. But in a still larger sense, we're going to talk about how a group of Marine Corps leaders, led by Wilson, put in place a system of techniques and processes that has led to creation of the highest quality military organization in the history of the world. And they did it at a time when every external and environmental factor was stacked against them. Lew Wilson was born in Brandon, Mississippi in 1920. His father died when the young Lew was 5 years old, so he developed a lifelong sense of responsibility of caring for his mother and his sister. The young Lew Wilson excelled at track and football. He was a good young athlete, and he attended college right in Jackson, Mississippi. During the summers, he used to work paving asphalt roads to earn some extra money. During one of these summer excursions, he met a beautiful young Mississippian named Jane Clark. The two started dating, and by the time it came for Lew to graduate in 1941, they didn't want to spend their lives with anybody else. But Lew had that sense of adventure. He wanted to get out of Mississippi and see the world, so he enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserves. Because he was a college graduate, he enrolled in Officer Candidate School and was commissioned in November 1941. And we know what happened in December 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor started World War II, and Lew Wilson was going to go off to fight the nation's wars in the Pacific. Jane Clark promised she'd wait for him. The young Second Lieutenant Wilson ended up on Guadalcanal, where he received jungle training. He excelled as a combat leader in the campaign on Bougainville. And then by the summer of 1944, Lew Wilson was promoted to captain and was commanding a company in the 3rd Marine Division for the Marines' attack on Guam. As the 3rd Marine Division crossed the beach at Guam, it very quickly became apparent that the key terrain feature of Guam was Chinito Ridge. The Japanese held Chinito Ridge. It provided perfect fields of fire for the landing beaches. There you can see it. And if the Marines did not take Chinito Ridge, they would not take Guam. Captain Wilson led his company to attack and sector a certain part of Chinito Ridge. They had secured that objective, but there was another part of the ridge called Fonte Hill that the Japanese had taken back. So Wilson organized a hasty patrol of 17 Marines, and they went to take Fonte Hill. 13 of the Marines were struck down, but in fierce hand-to-hand combat, Captain Wilson and the 4 Marines he had left took Fonte Hill, the Marines secured Chinito Ridge, and they won the Battle of Guam. Wilson was later awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions on Guam. After the war, he went on to command Marine Barracks, Washington, D.C. He served as the officer in charge of the recruiting station in New York City, where very interestingly he would learn some important lessons that he would apply later in his career. He was promoted. He commanded the Officer Candidate School Training Battalion at Quantico, Virginia. He went back out to California, commanded a battalion, and then he came back to Virginia and he commanded the Marine Corps' Officer Basic School. It's where all Marine Corps officers receive their basic training. Whether you're going to be a pilot, supply officer, or engineer, or whatever, every Marine learns how to command a basic rifle platoon. And Colonel Wilson commanded that. After commanding the basic school, he commanded the 6th Marine Corps District until he was promoted to Brigadier General. Upon promotion to Brigadier General, Wilson was the Commandant's liaison to the U.S. Congress. He served in Okinawa, Japan, and in 1975, he was in a post that some deemed as lofty exile in command of Marines in the Pacific out in Hawaii. It was in the spring of 1975 when the Commandant of the Marine Corps asked General Wilson to submit his papers for retirement. And in a move characteristic of the courage he had shown throughout his career, General Wilson refused. You see, in 1975, the Marine Corps was facing quite possibly the worst crisis of its 200-year existence. And this was not a crisis precipitated by Marines losing a fight on some distant battlefield. It could be far worse. The Marines had begun to lose their reputation for elitism in the eyes of the American people. And Wilson wanted to do something about it. Now, this Marines' sense of the loss of elitism stemmed from the nation's transition to an all-volunteer force. In the 1960s, Professor Milton Friedman was one of the best-known economists in the country. And as the Vietnam War was getting underway, he began writing articles in academic journals saying that the draft was not consistent with the values of a free society, that compelling people to serve in the military was inconsistent with liberty. But Friedman didn't just rely on high ideals of liberty. He also made economic arguments for why the draft did not make sense. First, he said, by compelling young people who would not otherwise want to serve in the military, by making them serve in the military, we are depriving the country of the economic benefit that these young people could be providing by doing something they really wanted to do, where they could earn more money and contribute to the tax base of the country. That's the first thing. The second thing is by compelling people to serve in the military, the wages for those who did serve in the military were kept artificially low because they did not have to compete for talent on the free market. So those young men and women who did choose to serve in the military were not paid what they deserved, which was a, quote, hidden tax. He called it a hidden tax on those who wanted to serve. So not only did Friedman make powerful idealistic arguments, but he made powerful economic arguments as to why the draft didn't make sense. Now, presidential candidate Richard Nixon got wind of these arguments, and 3 weeks before the election, he made abolition of the draft and transition to an all-volunteer force part of his campaign platform, and the opposition didn't really know how to respond. Nixon was elected president in 1968, and as his advisors urged him to go slow, that this is not really the time to do this, Nixon wanted to press full speed ahead. He created a bipartisan commission called the Gates Commission, chaired by former Secretary of Defense Thomas Gates. Milton Friedman and 2 other economists were on the commission, and the economists had been refining and practicing their arguments against the draft for years. Intellectually, the economists dominated the deliberations of the Gates Commission, and in 1970, the Gates Commission unanimously recommended to President Nixon that the country abolish the draft and transition to an all-volunteer force. The Secretary of Defense at the time, Melvin Laird, asked for 2 years to prepare the force to put the infrastructure in place to do this change. Now, the service chiefs, the heads of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines, argued to the Defense Secretary and the President that this was the worst possible time to make this change. The country was on the back end of a morally bruising war in Vietnam. Respect for the military across the country was at an all-time low, and young people were protesting on campuses. They showed no desire to serve voluntarily in the military. The service chief said this is the worst possible time to do this. But President Nixon said press ahead. So they pressed ahead. The Commandant of the Marine Corps at the time was General Robert Cushman. He was Wilson's battalion commander during the attack on Guam. And he issued the following guidance. We'll get the numbers, but getting the quality is going to mean very vigorous recruiting. Now, Cushman's guidance there seemed to imply that the numbers were more important than the quality. And as the nation transitioned to the all-volunteer force in 1973, the Marine Corps was not ready. J. Walter Thompson, the Marine Corps' advertising agency, which had been doing it pro bono from World War II to 1973, had began to advise Cushman that your marketing pitch, we don't promise you a rose garden, appeals to less than 7% of the youths in the country. The Commandant at the time thought, well, the Marine Corps doesn't really need to apply to more than 7% of the youths, so he didn't really see a problem with it. So going into 1973, with an emphasis on the numbers, with little preparation for recruiting, and with a marketing pitch that appealed to less than 7% of the youths, the Marine Corps entered the all-volunteer era. Within 6 months, the Marine Corps was facing a full-blown manpower crisis as the pool of recruits dried up, and recruiters, to make their mission in 1973, enlisted fewer than 50% high school graduates and 14% Category 4 applicants. These are applicants from the lowest mental group. Congress saw what the services were doing, and Congress grew so concerned with the amount of non-high school graduate, low-quality recruits entering all the branches of the military, they passed a section in next year's budget. It was Section 718. And what Congress stipulated in the budget for fiscal year 1974 was the military had to enlist at least 55% high school graduates. This section resulted in the unfortunate spectacle of the Commandant of the Marine Corps going up to Congress saying he did not believe in the value of a high school diploma as the sole determinant of success as a Marine, and he asked for easing of the restrictions from 718. And the results were predictably disastrous. Congress refused, and the Marine Corps continued to miss despite trolling the bottom of the barrel for quality. The Marine Corps would miss its mission in fiscal year 1974 by more than 9,000 recruits, which is more than 25% of our annual mission. Congress eventually did grant relief for Section 718, and the results of this were even worse. With the floodgates opened, the Marines enlisted thousands of non-high school graduate, low-quality applicants. This resulted in the Marine Corps having the worst disciplinary rate in the armed services. More than 18,000 Marines were on the rolls as deserters. Without Marines present to maintain equipment and to conduct training, equipment readiness began to decline, warfighting capabilities began to deteriorate, and as think tanks and as the American people saw this, they began to question the viability of the Marine Corps' amphibious mission. Do we even need an amphibious assault force in the atomic age? The Navy saw this, and they had conflict with the Marine Corps on the future of marine aviation. If the amphibious assault force is not really needed, do we need fighter attack aircraft that can provide close air support to amphibious landings? Into this environment, General Lew Wilson became the 26th Commandant of the Marine Corps on 1 July 1975. And he laid out his intent in one short sentence. I call upon all Marines to get in step and to do it smartly. Now, to say Wilson faced challenges would be a huge understatement. Let's look at the Marine Corps he inherited. Worst disciplinary rates in the armed services. Declining readiness. Declining warfighting capabilities. Drug problems had infested the Corps. Some of our bases had racial incidents on them. Conflict with the Navy over the future of marine aviation, and think tanks questioning the viability of the Marines' amphibious mission. Wilson knew he would need help, a lot of help, for the monumental challenges ahead, but he also knew just who to call. For at that time, there was a general commanding Marine Corps Recruit Depot Parris Island who shared Wilson's conviction that the core strength of the Marine Corps was the high quality of the individual Marine. And his name was Robert Barrow. General Barrow was born in Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1922. He grew up in a home without electricity in it, but he loved to read. He used to get his hands on everything he could read and read at night by a kerosene lamp. He was the editor of his school newspaper, and at that time, if you went to LSU and you enrolled in the school's Corps of Cadets, you could get free tuition if you were an in-state resident. So this is what the young Barrow did. He enrolled in LSU, he joined the Corps of Cadets, he worked part-time as a waiter and a janitor to get some extra spending money. One day on campus, he saw a Marine Corps officer. It appealed to him. He enrolled in the platoon leaders class program, but with the outbreak of World War II, Barrow's itch for action caused him to disenroll from the officer program, to enlist as a boot private, and ship off to San Diego. Barrow later recalled that getting on the train to go to San Diego as a private was the happiest moment of his life. Barrow's leadership and bearing clearly stood out at boot camp. In fact, he did so well at boot camp that the DIs there asked him to stay on as a DI to help train more recruits, because they had an influx of recruits coming with the expansion of the Marine Corps with World War II. So Barrow did that. He served as a drill instructor. Before too long, they recognized his obvious leadership capabilities. They sent him to officer candidate school. He received his commission, and he ended up in China, aiding Chinese guerrillas working behind Japanese lines in World War II. Now, Barrow did not take part in any of the great Marine battles across the Pacific, but he did earn a Bronze Star for his service in China, working behind Japanese lines. After World War II, he came back to the States. He went to school. He got command of a company and was in command of this company upon the outbreak of the Korean War. He led his Marines over the wall during the amphibious assault at Incheon. He led his Marines into the streets of Seoul for the liberation of that city. And afterwards, he led his company into the freezing mountain passes of the Chosin Reservoir. It was during the breakout from the Chosin Reservoir that Barrow's combat leadership would become known throughout the Marine Corps. Pushed recklessly north by two Army generals, General MacArthur and General Almond, the 1st Marine Division found itself fallen upon by 7 Chinese divisions. The division was cut off. Through a masterpiece of courage and small unit leadership, the division was able to consolidate at Hagaruri, which is at the base of the reservoir. The engineers cut an expeditionary airfield out of the frozen ground, and they evacuated their wounded, and they fought 10 miles south to Kotori. And there was a bridge across the Funchal Pass that had been blown by the Chinese. And the Chinese controlled the high ground around the bridge. So the bridge had to be repaired for the Marines to complete the breakout. The former LSU student, waiter, janitor, who had grown up without electricity in his home, received the mission to attack and seize Hill 1081, hold it at all costs. Against incredible odds, with temperatures dropping to negative 25 degrees, the Chinese threw everything they had at Barrow and his Marines. But something incredible happened. Against impossible odds, Barrow's Marines held. The division's engineers repaired the bridge, and the 1st Marine Division completed the breakout and achieved what would become an everlasting triumph in Marine Corps history. Barrow received Navy Cross, came back to the States, served as an ROTC instructor at Tulane University. He served as a plans officer at Marine Forces Pacific, and he later served as commander of the 9th Marines in the Vietnam War. Upon promotion to general, he was promoted. He moved out to Okinawa, where he commanded Marine Corps Base Camp Butler, and of course, he commanded Marine Corps Recruit Depot Parris Island. Now, Barrow was one of those generals who saw goodness and value in the work every Marine did for their country. And when he was commander of Marine Corps Base Camp Butler, he wrote a letter to his boss on improving job satisfaction and motivation, that we need to do a better job of stressing the importance of duty in the supporting establishment. In other words, not just the frontline combat jobs. Every job matters. He said that the Special Services officer and the clubs officer, 2 billets that were looked down upon by other officers, were 2 of the most important billets in the Western Pacific. Special Service officer was in charge of all the athletics and the recreational programs for forward deployed Marines. The clubs officer was in charge of a club system that did $7 million annually in sales and was responsible for 800 people. So when General Wilson picked up the phone and asked for help to resolve the Marine Corps' manpower crisis, the right Marine picked up at the other end of the line. Now, it is difficult to imagine a more powerful team of top generals to reform the Marine Corps' manpower crisis. Between the 2 of them, Wilson and Barrow, they had held every single billet within the entire entry-level pipeline. Let's review it. Recruit, Barrow. Officer candidate, Wilson. Drill instructor, Barrow. Recruiting station officer in charge, Wilson. ROTC instructor, Barrow. Officer candidate school commander, Wilson. Basic school commander, Wilson. Recruiting district commander, Wilson. Marine Corps Recruit Depot commander, Barrow. They had also seen the other end of that pipeline in the most difficult conditions imaginable, at Guam and the Chosin Reservoir. So these generals knew what it takes to make a good Marine, and they would not let anyone within the institution or out dilute their deeply held conviction that the core strength of the Marine Corps was the high quality, character, and capabilities of the individual Marines. And they would attack in the Quality War with the same fierceness and determination they showed at Guam and the Chosin Reservoir. And they put in place a series of reforms right away. First, they said from here on out, 3 out of 4 Marines will be high school graduates. They raised standards. They raised standards to come into the Marine Corps. Second, they toughened boot camp. They put recruiting and recruit training under the same commanding general. So there was improved accountability. Third, General Wilson announced that they were going to aggressively remove from our ranks all of those Marines who were not measuring up to our standards. Now, it is not difficult to see the brutal interrelationship of these three reforms. And some of Wilson's senior leaders pointed these out to him. They said, okay, General, so you're going to raise standards on the standard we're already missing, and we're already not getting enough recruits. You're going to raise that standard, okay? Second, by placing recruiting and recruit training under the same general at boot camp, your boot camp attrition is going to go up, so you're going to get even fewer Marines into the operating forces, okay? And third, by aggressively removing from our ranks those Marines who are not measuring up to standards, you're going to make the recruiting mission that you're already missing even higher. Generally, you're not going to have a Marine Corps left. And Wilson had an answer for him. If it's just me and my driver, we're going to have a quality Marine Corps. Now you get in step, and you do it smartly. And Wilson took this message out to the operating forces. Now, the young majors and lieutenant colonels out there, the Krulaks, the Bundys, the General Zinnis, those majors who would later go on to achieve 4-star rank, they were invigorated and empowered by this. They loved it. And Wilson was starting to get buy-in from the younger officers, like, yes, we're getting back to being an elite corps. When in December 1975, disaster struck. A young recruit, Lynn McClure, who was in the lowest mental group, who dropped out of high school in the 10th grade, who had been charged with several felonies, was erroneously enlisted into the Marine Corps out of Texas, and he ended up in one of the motivation platoons out in San Diego, out at boot camp. He was not conforming. The drill instructors did not know how to make him conform, and they ended up putting him in the middle of a group of other recruits with these training aids called pugil sticks that are used in bayonet fighting, and Private McClure was beat into a coma, and he died 3 months later. Upon this, Congress, expressing the will of the American people, said enough. And they started developing plans to take boot camp out of the Marines' jurisdiction and either have a joint facility do it or have the Army do it. And they called Generals Wilson and Barrow up to the Hill to testify on what they were going to do about it. So Wilson and Barrow went up to the Hill, and they announced a second series of reforms. First, they said, we're eliminating the motivation platoons. Those platoons are gone. Second, we are going to double the number of officers at our recruit depots, and we're going to put a brigadier general there to be in charge of the supervisory program. Third, we're going to have improved screening, psychiatric evaluation of all Marines we assign as drill instructors. So sociopathic, abusive individuals do not end up in a position to train recruits. And fourth, every recruit is going to have a protected channel of communication with their series commander or company commander, one of the officers that they put there. To illustrate Wilson's determination to make these boot camp reforms stick, there's a little anecdote from this period that could be apocryphal, but it's indicative of his determination. During a recess of one of the testimonies, one of Wilson's aides came to him and said, sir, I was just on the phone, and San Diego has disbanded their motivation platoon. Parris Island has given the order, but they haven't officially disbanded it yet, but they've said they're going to. Wilson wheeled on his aide, and he said, by the time I go back in there to resume testimony, that platoon will be gone. The trembling aide relayed the message. They brought bulldozers from across town from Marine Wing Support Squadron 273. They bulldozed in the motivation ditch where the motivation platoon had trained, and the motivation platoon was indeed gone forever. So with this, the Marines were able to keep boot camp. They were still not getting the quality people that they needed. So Wilson announced in the spring of 1977, a third series of reforms. First, he had one of his former district commanders who had made general write a book, the Volume 1, the Guidebook for Recruiting Operations. And this book would standardize how the Marine Corps was going to recruit across the entire Corps. So first, there was standardization. Second, he had a team of officers and staff non-commissioned officers physically travel to every recruiting station, and there's 48 in the country, and recruiting substation, and there's 550 in the country, over a 2-month period, and install the components of systematic recruiting. So recruiting was now standardized across the Marine Corps. Third, he stood up a headquarters screening team that would travel across the Marine Corps every year and select the best staff non-commissioned officers and non-commissioned officers to come out to the streets of America to find those young men and women of character to serve as Marines. Fourth, those staff non-commissioned officers who did the best at recruiting were incentivized to stay out there through creation of a new occupational field called a career recruiter, who understood the system, who understood how to make it work. These Marines would have pathways to promotion, expanded opportunities, they could get more pay, and exercise more leadership. Fifth, a national training team was established that would travel the country every year and ensure that the components of systematic recruiting were being properly maintained by the staff non-commissioned officers and the officers in the recruiting stations. Sixth, the recruiting districts used to be responsible for the administration of the reserve units as well as the recruiting mission, and Wilson knew, especially in the all-volunteer era, that district commander needed to be focused solely on recruiting, on finding those young men and women of character who would be the future of the Marine Corps. So he removed the administration of the reserve units from the recruiting districts. Seventh, he created a recruiting management course up at Leesburg, Virginia. It was a 2-week course that every officer and sergeant major coming onto recruiting duty would attend to understand the components of systematic recruiting and how to lead in a recruiting environment. And just to make sure everyone knew, he put his personal stamp on these changes, on these reforms. He introduced a poster, and the poster's up there from 1977. I'm looking for a few good Marines to help me find a few good recruits. Our recruiters have never been better. Their dedication to quality is reflected in today's recruits. All I need is a few more outstanding NCOs to take up this challenging work and help shape the future of our Corps. Recruiting duty, challenging opportunity for exceptional Marines. And of course, there's that light blue ribbon with 5 white stars that just gives that added credibility to the importance of this mission. Let me explain the system that they put in place for about 2 minutes, because if there's a Rosetta Stone for you on recruiting and retaining quality people, this is it. This is the recruiting process. First, obtain names. As Wilson and Barrow had identified as the high school market is where the quality kids came from, this was where we were going to recruit. So we got those names. Prospected them. We went out there and we told the Marine Corps story to high schools. Screened them. As you meet a young man or woman, make sure they are mentally, physically, and morally fit. Being elite means you have young men and women of character. Selling them. Sitting down with them and explaining to them what the Marine Corps is all about. The type of young man or woman we are looking for is someone who is motivated by intangibles. They don't just want money for college, or they don't just want technical skills, although we have that, but so do the other services. We're looking for those who want to challenge, who want to be put in charge, who want leadership, who want discipline, who want to travel, and want that pride of being part of an elite organization. Processing them at a military entrance processing station, getting them ready for life in the Marine Corps with our pool program, shipping them, and then once they graduate, this young man or woman of character in the best shape of their life, and they've experienced the miracle of the transformation, and that's what it is, and the transformation is forever, taking this young Marine and putting them back into their high schools and the communities of America, where they will serve as a magnetic force for other young men and women who want the same thing. This was the process. And you know what happened across the Marine Corps? They saw that the elitism started to come back, because Wilson and Barrow would attack and reattack and reattack and reattack, just like they did at Guam. No hand-wringing, no, oh, woe was us, no blaming anyone else, taking responsibility and getting good people into the Marine Corps. And as this happened, the elitism of the Corps started to return. And remember those challenges I talked about that Wilson inherited about training and declining readiness? With Barrow as assistant commandant, he started to get after those too. The fourth round of reforms impacted the Marine Corps writ large. First, they procured the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center at 29 Palms. This is a live fire training range in the desert where the Marines could practice combined arms training, integrating air and ground combat support, and get our warfighting capabilities back. Second, Wilson created the Marine Aviation Weapons and Tactics Squadron 1 at Yuma, Arizona, that would educate pilots across the Marine Corps on how to provide close air support in amphibious assault operations. They would also do live fire training. This is the premier training squadron within the Department of Defense. Third, remember that conflict about the future of marine aviation? Wilson was able to procure the FA-18 and the AV-8B Harrier to provide close air support for amphibious operations. The FA-18, arguably the most successful multi-role combat fighter in history. Of course, they would teach the tactics of the F-18 at MOTS 1. I love to point out to my aviator friends that not only was MOTS 1 created by a ground marine, but by someone who was at heart a recruiter. And fourth, the Commandant of the Marine Corps had not been a full-fledged member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He had been invited to sit in on tank sessions where they would discuss issues relevant to the Marine Corps, but he was not a full-fledged JCS member and was viewed as less than his counterparts. Congress saw this, and as the Marine sense of elitism returned, he said, you know, this really isn't right. And the Commandant of the Marine Corps was made a standing member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, while this was going on in the Marine Corps, the other services, unfortunately, suffered some serious recruiting problems. In the late 70s, there was a misnorming of the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery, and the other services had erroneously let several low-quality applicants who otherwise would not have been qualified into the ranks. And this got the attention of Congress, and it even got the attention of former President Richard Nixon. In 1980, Nixon sadly wrote, "I considered the end of the draft in 1973 to be one of the major achievements of my administration. Now, 7 years later, I have reluctantly concluded that we should reintroduce the draft. The volunteer army has failed to provide enough personnel of the caliber we need." But if Nixon was declaring the failure of the all-volunteer force, nobody bothered to tell the Marines or their new commandant. General Barrow took command of the Marine Corps in June 1979 and had one order for his Marines. Keep in step, he told them. Barrow started talking about going all the way to 100% in high school graduates in recruiting. He let all Marines know that in peacetime, the most important thing that Marines could do was to recruit well and to make good Marines. And he set a goal for more than tripling the number of women Marines to get all the way up to 10,000. And while General Barrow did not advocate putting women Marines into infantry jobs or frontline combat jobs, he was absolutely adamant that women Marines have an expanded role in the Marine Corps and that they have a way up. With his Marines in lockstep behind him, the hero of Finchillan Pass would march the Marine Corps into a new golden age. A golden age that saw the establishment of the Maritime Pre-Positioning Force Program, pre-positioned stocks of equipment that marry up with Marines that have been used in every major contingency since their establishment, forward-deployed Marine air-ground task forces that have responded to hundreds of crises and saved thousands of lives, and that are out there in hotspots this morning and tonight and every night to do our country's bidding and to protect American interests. The eradication of drug use from our Corps, and of course an ever-increasing quality and elitism on the recruiting and recruit training front. The culmination of this revolution in making Marines occurred in 1981 with General Barrow's creation of the Commandant's Superior Achiever Award to recognize every recruiting station in the country that it exceeded its quality goals in every measurable category for recruiting for the fiscal year. General Barrow left Commandant in 1983, and it was probably not a coincidence that the next year a book appeared. And the book is a brilliant, eloquent, and timeless articulation of the ethos, values, and elitism of the Marine Corps. The book was written by Lieutenant General Victor H. Krulak, the father of the current president of Birmingham Southern College. The book is called First to Fight, and it remains essential reading for all Marines to this day. Now, this would probably be a good place to end this story. But of course, the story doesn't end there, because the story of making Marines continues to this day. And through the tenures of Commandants General Kelly and General Gray, the Marine Corps' quality was sustained, and the country got the Marines who performed so brilliantly during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. During the post-Cold War drawdown of the 1990s, with a shrinking demographic pool and the policy of the administration of President Bill Clinton that made it easier for young men and women to go to college, Generals Mundy and General Krulak would orchestrate a second revolution in Marine Corps recruiting and making Marines. They had both served as foot soldiers in the Wilson-Barrow Revolution, and they raised standards yet again. They created the Marine Corps Recruiting Command, and they added a week, General Krulak added a week to recruit training and made it harder with a 54-hour event called the Crucible. These changes sustained the Marine Corps through the longest wars our country's fought in Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, through the tenures of General Jones, General Hagee, General Conway, and General Amos. Under General Conway and General Amos, the Marine Corps even expanded from 177,000 to 202,000 without ever once sacrificing quality and accepting a lower quality Marine. And then in October 2014, General Joseph Dunford became the 36th Commandant of the Marine Corps. Now, General Dunford has some mystical connections to the giants of yesteryear of our Corps. He was commissioned in 1977 and would have come on active duty right at the height of the Wilson-Barrow Revolution. He would have seen the Marine Corps that was, what the Marine Corps would become. General Dunford's father had fought with the 5th Marines at the Chosin Reservoir, and he would have been one of those battle-hardened Marines fighting south down the Finchillan Pass, while Captain Barrow and his Marines held their grip on Hill 1081. General Dunford commanded the 5th Marines during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and he was the theater commander of all coalition forces in Afghanistan before becoming Commandant. Yet it was no surprise to us during his first month as Commandant to see General Dunford show up at Marine Corps Recruit Depot Paris Island and troop the line of the Corps' newest Marines. The very next week, he traveled to San Diego and presented the Commandant's Superior Achiever Awards to those recruiting station commanders who had exceeded all their quality goals. So this is the legacy of General Lew Wilson. What are the lessons? I believe there are 4 big ones. 1, first, think big. Every one of you at some point are going to be experiencing a crisis. Maybe you're in the midst of a crisis right now. Within that crisis, there's going to be a path to expedience, where you can solve the demands of that crisis, or there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity for you to make your organization a quantum leap better. Think big. Seize opportunity. Second, collaborate. It was never about Wilson. He never put his own name on these reforms. It was always about the institution. Find people you can collaborate with, collaborate, make the organization better. Third, inspect what you expect. Notice the photos we've seen of General Wilson inspecting recruits, General Barrow inspecting recruits, and one of the first things General Dunford did as Commandant of the Marine Corps. Inspect what you expect and also know what to inspect. There are no details when it comes to people beneath an executive in the organization. Which brings me to the final point: people matter most. Wilson was able to achieve broad reform on many fronts because he got the people right at the front end. And if there's a place to close, I think it's this, because people matter most in whatever organization or undertaking you're a part of. The issue of people will transcend all else. How we recruit them, train them, coach them, mentor them, will ultimately determine the success of our organizations. Lead them well, and there's no limit to what we can achieve. Thank you. God bless you, and Semper Fidelis.